For our final session today, we have Carl Preisner, who is HR Director, Global Equity and Inclusion at Procter and Gamble, and Raman Sehgal, host of Modern Minorities and the P&G Alumni Podcasts. They're going to talk about what we've learned this year and how to create a culture that is rooted in DEI for the future.
My name is Raman Sehgal. I'm a recovering marketer, and I have a few podcasts like Modern Minorities and Learnings from Leaders, where I host candid conversations with voices in the space, like the one I'm really excited to have today. And of course, if you've got questions, please let us know, and we'll try to answer some of them afterwards, or just reach out and connect with Carl or myself on LinkedIn. But today, I'm really pleased to have a conversation with my longtime friend and colleague, Carl Preisner, who is HR Director for Global Diversity and Inclusion at Procter and Gamble. Carl, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Raman, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. And I also want to thank those that came before. You and I have been listening to some of the talks, and we're in some great company. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So first, for everyone else, I got to call out the elephant in the room. We're two men having a conversation on something that is not just about men. Carl, can you tell us a little bit more about your role at P&G?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Raman. And you're right. This is not just about men, and it's also very much about men, right? Because while men are not oppressed, for instance, by gender inequality, a topic that came up in the first commercial we showed, we do face costs, and also because we want a more equal world for people of all genders, it's going to take the engagement of those in dominant groups, those with relatively more power and privilege to be advocates for that change. And as it relates to gender, that generally means cisgendered men. So that's what I do. I work to build advocates among insiders to help us bring about and achieve our aspirations for change, among other things.
So when we met years ago, you were a chemical engineer in R&D, but you were always very socially active. So how long have you been in this kind of role at P&G? And honestly, how has P&G been doing this sort of specific work in allyship and advocacy?
Yeah, it's funny because reflecting on the journey, I never thought I'd end up here. I spent the first 18 years of my career in R&D, and then made a jump about almost 5 years ago now into equality and inclusion. And in some ways that may look like a leap, but it's actually, for those who spend almost any time at all, you start to see that these things are very intimately related. Understanding of bias, understanding of and the way it works in innovation has much to teach us about understanding bias and how it may help or hurt us in our own people systems. In a sense, the not invented here mindset, which prevents a lot of good things from coming to market, has its own corollary with people. So probably more than I had intended to say on that, but I intentionally for the last 5 years. But that said, P&G has been here much longer. I mean, for us, this is a historical legacy. It's actually one of the reasons why I came here was understanding of people and putting people at the center was critically important. So P&G started hiring women on our packing lines back in the 1800s and had supplier diversity programs in the early 70s and have intentionally invested now in what I'll think of as insider conversations and engagements for the last 4 or 5 years. And I'll make one distinction. I think you'd mentioned allyship, and that's not a bad word, but for me it's a little incomplete. I prefer partnership. And the reason why I prefer partnership versus allyship, for me, when I think of allyship, ally for me was a word most commonly when I think of World War II and allies about, who were the allies overseas for the U.S. I was born in the U.S. and raised there. And so ally for me had a connotation of there's something happening over there that isn't directly about me, but I'm going to help. That's the wrong context for what we're talking about for equality and inclusion. Every element of equality and inclusion very much affects me, even as a white, straight male who grew up, in Midwest U.S. So I prefer partnership because what it does is it brings in that this is about me as well. I have things to gain. I can face costs. I also care very much about and am impacted by the extent to which others are facing inequity. So, too often this conversation in the past in our company had been when we're talking about gender inequality, for instance, we would have this misleading conversation. We're all thinking we're talking about women. Or the corollary would show up in race. We're talking about race. And in the back of everyone's mind, the implicit assumption is we're talking about black or brown people, right? And what gets left out of the conversation too often were the insiders, in those cases, white men. And what that means, what gets left out isn't not left out like, hey, I want my stuff too, and I'm not getting a chance. But I mean perspectives left out. I mean more like problems, and even the way problems are viewed become distorted and possibilities get missed. And just an example, just to bring it home, why having insider conversations, why exploring and examining that is so important, for me, shows up in one of those common, I would say, myths related to this space is the confidence gap that is often associated with explaining why women don't show up in more positions of leadership. That for me is a great example of how a narrow conversation has misidentified a problem. Because if you look at some of the original studies that came back, that whole problem came, I think it may have been an HP study or something where, they showed a job description. They surveyed 100 men, 100 women. They gave them a job description with 10 facts. And if they identified that if the men met 2 of the 10 criteria, they said, great, I'm ready for this job, I want to apply. And if the women in the study, self-identified women, met only 2, they said, I'm going to wait till I get like 8 or 10. Now, the team then looks at this and goes, great, the issue is women don't have enough confidence. Well, that assessment only makes sense if there's a norm that is predominantly male, that says correct is a male perspective of I only have 2, and so I'm going to go ahead and apply. And incorrect is the women, and they need to change. I think you could look at it the opposite, right? Why are we not talking about the overconfidence of men who aren't qualified for a role and yet are applying anyway? And I don't necessarily think we want to swing the pendulum other way. All this is just to tie. My work is very much about bringing in more complete perspectives, bringing in insiders like me, might be fish and waters to help engage change, but also we work better together. So long story, this is what P&G's work is very much about these days. We're very committed. And I think we're seeing some results now. It's been very gratifying to work in this.
So by now we've heard many people talk about what an unprecedented year this has been. That's the understatement of the decade. But as the video we just shared shows, this is not unprecedented. What's changed and what hasn't changed for the way that P&G is handling kind of this new workplace landscape that we're all living in?
That's a great question, and part of why we made the video was to really draw out that this, just to tie this to the historical context, right? That these systems we're facing, these outcomes we're facing, are new and not new, right? This is a new pandemic. We've had pandemics before, so you're absolutely right. We are, and that's important to think about, because if we want to get different outcomes, we have to start going, well, why does it continue to happen over time? Why is this not the first time when in the downturn we've seen underrepresented groups suddenly face even more stress? So for P&G, and this is, I think the phrase we'd say as we've gone through this is we can never not know what we now know, right? Our company, speaking from the company's perspective, we've gone through a transformational experience. I know for me personally, it's been difficult, it's been transformative. We've learned tremendous things. Some things worked, a lot of things we needed to improve. And for us, we knew at the start, I remember back in, the time warp of this whole thing, I think it was back in March of last year, our leadership came together and said, let's pull together some insights of how we want to prepare for this. And I put together one for you and I. And we knew up front we were going to face a challenge on retention of our underrepresented groups, particularly women. And you may have seen the recent study that, of course, was true. It was predictable, and it did happen. In the most recent jobs report, I think 100% of the job losses were women in the U.S., and that's replicated globally. And so we made a commitment. We wanted to make sure this didn't happen. And some of the things that helped us were already in place. And some of these have been mentioned before. P&G, we've been investing in a diverse workforce for a long time, and that meant building in flexibility. So for a long time, we've had a program called Flex at Work. It's a set of policies and also cultural norms that we communicated about the ability to work work remotely if you need be, work at different hours, agreements about when we're going to hold meetings and not. So, for instance, let's get rid of the mandatory 7:30 meeting, which puts stress on people who are, raising kids, mostly women and some men. And so we had those in place. We've also learned some new things, really, and we're actually intentionally now creating a new project called Workways, which is trying to then take those learnings and build it into our future from a white sheet of paper. Again, recognizing we can't unknow this experience of what we've been able to accomplish when we couldn't sit across from each other. And so that's, we really want to bring this to life.
So what stayed the same? What hasn't changed? Like, you guys have been doing this work for a while. So in this crisis, how are you staying the course?
Right. So I think one of the things I mentioned was investing in a workforce and in a culture and policies that make it possible for a diverse group to work together is consistent. As we think about really recreating the future, there's some things we think we'll still keep. So P&G has been a relationship-based culture. We view it as a competitive advantage. We know the people we're working with in deep ways. We want to keep that the same, right? We've got tons of invested infrastructure. We have offices. We see those as assets to build the culture, as assets to collaborate. So we will keep those in some form or fashion. We also view inclusion and wellness development as part of the things we want to keep going forward. And really the interdependency of decision making for us. So those four things I'd say as we think about, hey, we're starting with a white sheet of paper. How do we want to operate? Those are sort of our guiding principles. That, and I might say our purpose, values, and principles as a company. Those have served us, and we want to keep them.
But I got to ask, as we look to the future, Carl, as P&G looks to the future, what do you think has to change?
And that's, well, actually, they're both interesting. I suppose what we want to keep the same is an exploration. What we think we might want to change, and we're very, which does my R&D heart good, we're humble. We have hypotheses, and we're going to kind of pilot some of these things. We'll pilot some of these things now. Some of the things we think will change in this new work way of the future is that our offices now become enhanced by regular use of remote spaces. That's one. So it's here. We've been successful with it. We want to figure out, in some ways, even more successful. I can't tell how many suddenly global calls I've been on because all it meant was sending an invitation to a few more people, so regular use of remote spaces. I think teams having more ownership over how they want to design their time. So we're really organizing around a team to give a team a decision of when they work, where they work, and how they're going to work. And I mean everything from down to maybe 1 day a week in the office to 5 days a week. It's maybe 0 days in the week. We're centering the team, and we're leaving those as open questions. Our hypothesis is we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle. Maybe 3 days in the office on average, something like that. But then we want to amplify. So we've got some questions about how do we change the office environment, recognizing people are going to be here differently, different frequencies at different times, to center it around those moments when we're collaborating, those moments when we're being creative together. And then how do we bring in the tools and technologies to do it? That's been mentioned in some of the other conversations here. So those are the things we know are going to change. One last thing I'll add in here, this is my personal perspective, and I think this has been mentioned earlier, our language is going to have to change along with it.
Yeah.
And we learned this from some of the people that have done it. There are companies that have done this early. I would hear stories of how language was not thought of, but was very powerful. And here's an example. If when we continue to operate in this new world, we keep referring to people who might be working at a different location as they're working from home or they're working remote, and we keep normalizing a default, which is the office is normal, and we need a label for people who aren't doing that, we're going to struggle to make the change and get the impact we want. So like everything in equality and inclusion, we're also going to have to pay attention to the language we use, and maybe even resetting my hypothesis. Maybe we just say, look, everyone is remote, 100%. Whether you're in the office or not, the label we're giving to everyone is you're all remote. And that's just one of the things we'll try and do to make sure that we are addressing those unconscious biases and assumptions that come along with them in this new environment.
It's almost like through language, you're changing the frame of reference. So there's a
what
really
it is.
big
It's
difference.
exactly what it is.
Yeah. So look, there's this really big difference between equality and equity. Equality achieves these sort of things through treating everyone the same, regardless of their need. But what equity achieves is by treating people differently, dependent on their need. Can you talk about how men and women are experiencing things differently right now?
Yes, and that is, so you're absolutely right. I think you gave the definition of difference between equality and equity. What's going on right now is this huge stress test, right? We're all under tremendous stress.
Yeah.
Even if you're lucky enough not to have the emotional stress, it's now stress of finding new ways to doing things. Stress tends to amplify bias. When we're mentally spent, when we're emotionally spent, our decision making becomes more narrow, it becomes more automatic. And that tends to amplify systemic inequities, right? Because one of the things we knew was going to happen, sure enough, it happens out. And I don't just mean the overt bigotry or bias which may show up, I also mean the in some ways more powerful systemic biases. So let me give you an example. Because of systemic and cultural biases, the impact of this whole experience is greatest on those who care for their household or care for children. That's typically women, but also some men. That happened both as we went to this remote world, and there was some group of people who were trying to figure out, how do I take care of my kids because my daycare got shut down and the school got shut down. The same thing's happening as we come back, right? I think that if we don't pay any attention at all to how we're supporting our employees as they come back, the people that come back first are the people with the fewest needs. That's just going to be the way it is. That's not, however, our necessary intention. What we want is equitable return of our employees. We want equitable support of our employees, not just who happen to be available at the time. And we want it for all the reasons we care about diversity and inclusion, right? Because our collaboration depends on these diverse voices. Our thinking is improved when we integrate different people. We don't want those things to be subject to just who happen to have a daycare system available to them or other. Now, we don't have solutions for all these things, but one of the messages we have with our leadership very regularly is we have to be having these conversations with our employees, with our reports. We have to be talking about them. We have to be building. And I'm very comfortable to say that my greatest fear was we'd see a big hit in our pipeline as a result of this, and we have largely escaped that. If we look at our gender diversity, we have stayed on track. We have not seen great disparities in retention across gender or race or the other things we're tracking, and it's only because we anticipated and we spent so much time on this ahead of time. So did that answer your question?
I think it did. I want to shift gears a little bit, but kind of staying the course here. We have a mutual friend, Nicole. She founded a company called Queen City Certified that's actually helping businesses creating the fundamental systems change for greater workplace equity. And while this sort of work is happening with a lot of companies and a lot of different avenues, something Nicole likes to quote is, there will be equality at work only when there is equality at home. And that's a really powerful philosophy, because it's all fine and good to kind of put the policies in place. But how does this sort of philosophy factor into some of the decisions that you guys at P&G have to make for the future of work?
We share it very much so. Yeah, and that gets to a thread we've had throughout this, which is really that there is no changing one person without changing another. We are interlinked. We are interconnected, and that hits it. So I agree. We'll have equality at the workplace when we have equality at home. So for P&G, part of how that comes to life for us had been, as we've looked at how are we creating barriers to equality, even at home. One of the ones that stuck out first was our parental leave policy. And we believe that care for home and family has no gender. So when we looked at it, we're like, this does not fit with our values. It also creates barriers for our employees, and because of what Nicole said, we know it has negative impact on our ability to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. So in the middle of this pandemic, we had changed our policy. We have normalized, it was the only policy we had which had a specific gender bias. We have now normalized. We have 8 weeks fully paid leave for parents, also domestic partners, adoptive parents, and parents in same-sex couples. And then mothers have an additional 6 weeks for recovery leave.
I think
there's more I want to say on it, but I think you had a question, so let me just pause for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, something that's really powerful about your approach is companies like P&G need to see the employees as assets instead of liabilities. We're seeing a lot of layoffs, and it's a real mindset shift for people to kind of be seen as the most important asset as a company. So, but as we've talked about before, the current situation has the potential to exacerbate a lot of the bias and inequality. So I guess the last question is, what are the sort of things that you would tell companies big and small to think about to make sure they address this even in kind of this crisis that we're in right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm glad you said big and small, because it is something that is just as important for big as small. And you and I had some experience on both sides of that. I suppose there's 3 questions that come to mind for me when I think about this. One is, as we're exploring our company, our employees, our opportunities, I think a starting point is, can we be disinterested in being right? Particularly as leaders, can we actively doubt our objectivity in that we're seeing all the things that are getting in the way, all the things that are helping, and that our understanding is complete? And I think a second thing, particularly in many places of leadership where there are still, if you're an insider, if you're male dominated in leadership, if white men still have many of the positions of leadership, but insiders in general, another important thing to think about is, can I be disinterested in being a good person? Can I release for a minute the need to have this, I'm a good person? And the reason why those 2 questions are important, and a mentor of mine gave these to me one time, and just pretty powerful, is when we can do those 2 things, be disinterested in being right and give up, at least for a while, our need to be a good person, we can start to see where the problems are really coming about. We have a wider field of view, we can hear more input, and we can participate and collaborate in ways we couldn't. And particularly as it relates to equality and inclusion, we have to explore systems of power, and we have to explore systems of privilege if we want to create diverse workforces that can support full diversity and be inclusive. So I think I would give those just as compass questions, right? Is being disinterested in being right, and releasing for all the need to be a good person and to go explore and to learn. And I think with those 2 things, we can make progress.
So, Carl, we've only got a couple minutes left, and we've gotten a lot of really great questions. So feel free to reach out to us offline. But one question from the audience that I do want to ask is, how do you establish the mindset and leadership that people need time to do all of this important work and not just say, sure, this is important, do it on top of everything else that you're doing? How can companies kind of open up the time for people to, or kind of systemically address some of these changes?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's important. And it is a mindset shift. I think you mentioned this before, Raman. There's 2 things I hear in it. One is I would challenge the premise of that question among leadership itself, not the person who's asking it, but I mean, heard that question. I'm fortunate to work in a company. We had a CEO named John Pepper, who was famous for he said that was the great canard of leadership, was that somehow there's business and then there's the people, and those things are separate. And what he consistently reinforced is those are the same thing. Part of making the business important is making sure our people are capable, that our people are the business. And so part of the answer is just reframing this as, this is how we do that work. Having employees that can show up on time, who can connect to someone else who isn't homesick, or has to be out because they don't have the support they need. Those things drive the business. We can integrate our thinking better when we can connect to a broader range of view. I often wonder how many things I could have learned but didn't, because the people I was working around weren't always the best people. It was just the people who had the fewest needs and worked their way through the system. And so one of it is just, I'd say, reframing it. I think the other two is really, it takes time, and it takes time to kind of reinforce that these things relate to each other. I suppose that's maybe redundant, so I'm going to pause on that one. I think mostly it's a mindset shift, and it's continually reinforcing that these things drive and making connections about how business grows as we have more complete perspectives, solve bigger challenges.
No conversation among ex-P&Gers and current P&Gers would be complete without a John Pepper quote about people. Carl, I've really missed some of our conversations here, but glad to see you doing and helping lead this really important work inside and outside. So when all this ends, we'll get back together and read some comic books together.
Yeah, you bet. I look forward to it. Thanks, Roman. Thanks for
so much
walking us through.